My name's Ballou. I'm here at Vanderbilt, and I'm going to be introducing this panel, which is called Lessons from Research. Our panelists are not going to be going in the order that they're listed in the program. Instead, we'll begin with Sara Stoelinga of the University of Chicago. She'll be followed by Robert Rothman of Alliance for Excellent Education. He will be followed by Lynn Holdheide, also of Vanderbilt, and her co-author, Dan Reschly, is up here with her and may be participating when it comes to questions and answers. And then finally, our fourth presenter will be John Tyler of Brown University. So they'll just come up now in that sequence, and when they're finished, we'll take questions from the rest of you.
Good morning. I'm Sara Stoelinga. I'm from the Urban Education Institute at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to be talking today about the pilot of the Excellence in Teaching initiative, which is being undertaken in Chicago Public Schools. I'm going to start out by just giving you the timeline of this pilot so you can get a sense of what Chicago's been trying to accomplish. And then I'm going to highlight just a few findings from research that the Consortium on Chicago School Research has undertaken on this pilot. But to give you a sense of the timeline, the pilot actually started being designed in 2006. There was a joint committee of Chicago Public Schools leadership and the Chicago Teachers Union who came together to revitalize teacher evaluation in Chicago. For 2 years, they planned that pilot, and they selected the Charlotte Danielson framework for teaching for that work. In 2008-09, that was actually year one of the pilot, 44 elementary schools started piloting the Charlotte Danielson framework. This past year, that number of elementary schools jumped to 100. And next year, originally in the pilot design, was to be moving to 232 elementary schools and 28 high schools, although that timeline has changed. So let me tell you a little bit about the process here. The idea behind this was the goal behind the pilot was really to establish a shared language around teacher quality and teacher effectiveness in Chicago, and using the Charlotte Danielson framework for teaching to establish that common language. The series of observations at 2 time points for each of these 44 principals undertaking this pilot, and 4 parts to that sequence in the observation: a pre-observation conference, an observation in which the principal would go into the classroom and take scripted notes on what he or she was seeing. They would then take those scripted notes and sit down with the Charlotte Danielson framework and actually apply ratings across the 10 components, the 10 observable components of the Danielson framework, using evidence from their scripted notes to justify their ratings. And then finally, a post-observation conference with the teacher. And again, at 2 time points for each teacher across, in the first year, 44 principals, across the second year, 100 principals in elementary schools in Chicago. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Charlotte Danielson framework for teaching, or this modified version, which Chicago Public Schools has called the Chicago Public Schools Framework for Teaching, it consists of 4 domains. 2 of the domains are the focus of the Danielson work in Chicago, domains 2 and 3, which are the observable domains in the classroom, domain 2, the classroom environment, and domain 3, instruction. So the consortium's role in this has been to focus on 3 broad sets of research questions in looking at this pilot in Chicago. Excuse me. First of all, is the framework a good tool for teacher evaluation? Is it reliable? So if 2 observers go into the classroom and look at the same practice without talking to each other, do they give the same rating? Second of all, is it a valid tool? So do teachers who receive a high rating on the Charlotte Danielson framework also have the highest student test score gains in their classrooms? Second of all, we have a set of research questions that focused on, can the Danielson tool scale to district use? So if you think about the variation in principal leadership, in school culture, in the size of schools, in the differences between elementary, middle, and high school settings, can this tool be scaled such that a district could use it in all schools successfully and fairly? And finally, how does this teacher evaluation system relate to school change? So is it the case that if you implement this at the school level, you see changes in school culture, you see changes in the way schools are organized, you see changes in instruction at the school level? And in return, then, how does the school context influence implementation of this pilot? So today, I'm going to boil down what you would find if you went on the consortium website in 2 technical reports that are both over 80 pages, and also a policy brief that we released on our year 1 findings, and a forthcoming report from the consortium this fall. And I've just picked 7 salient findings that I think will be interesting for you today. But again, happy to talk in more detail about any of these or other aspects of our study when we get to the panel portion of this. First of all, the main focus of our year 1 study has been on reliability. If 2 observers go into the same classroom, do they give teachers the same rating on the Danielson framework without talking to one another? And basically what we found is that in aggregate, there's no difference between principals and external observers when they go into classrooms. These external observers were hired for research purposes. Their ratings did not count for teachers in terms of the ratings they received from the school district. They went into classrooms alongside principals at the same time. They did not talk to the principals. They had no background information on the teachers' prior ratings. And essentially, what we do is we analyze in aggregate across these ratings to see if there are systematic differences between principals and external observers, and we found that there weren't. Now again, this is setting aside for a moment, not looking at the exact rating given on a given lesson for a given teacher, but rather looking at the distribution of ratings overall. Second of all, important is that the framework is especially reliable at the unsatisfactory level. So the Charlotte Danielson framework unsatisfactory bar is set at a very low level, as many of you probably know. She defines it as doing harm to students across the 10 components. And so because this bar is so low, the tool is reliable, especially reliable at the unsatisfactory level, which is good news if we're going to use this tool for sanctions, to identify teachers for mandatory professional development, et cetera. However, that being said, while the framework is reliable, and especially so at the bottom end, we do see that there are individual differences in rater severity. What that means is that relative to the external raters, we had a group of principals who were especially severe in their ratings, about 30%, and especially lenient in their ratings, about 16%. So what this means is that while there aren't systematic differences, some principals are shifting their ratings up, and some principals are shifting their ratings down systematically across the teachers and classrooms that they're rating, which becomes important, again, if we're going to use this for some kind of a summative purpose, like removing teachers or identifying teachers for professional development. Second of all, we found that the framework does differentiate among teachers in a way that the prior CPS system did not. So what you see here is a pie chart that has the distribution of ratings for Chicago Public Schools teachers in 2007. As you can see, 61% of the teachers were rated excellent, 61% were rated superior, 32% excellent, 7% satisfactory, and less than 1% were rated unsatisfactory. What you see in our first year study is that this distribution looks a lot different. We see 37% got all proficient or distinguished ratings, 22% are mostly proficient, 33% are a mix of basic and proficient, and 8% of teachers received at least one of these unsatisfactory ratings, which again is a very low bar. So we found that the framework differentiates among teachers in a way that the traditional system did not, which is important. Thirdly, while it's the case that principals are using the rating scale consistently, and while it is reliable, especially at the bottom end of the scale, we do find that principals use the distinguished rating, the top rating in the scale, more frequently than external observers do. So what you see here is that the unsatisfactory and basic distribution of ratings is roughly the same between principals and external observers. But if you look at the proficient and distinguished, you see the principals are more likely to use the distinguished category when the external observers are using the proficient category. Principals recognized this in interviews, and they pointed to things like wanting to coach teachers rather than argue about the ratings, or pointing to the old system in which a teacher received a superior rating and not wanting to downgrade them to proficient, they would award the distinguished instead. So there are some issues here about the way the top end of the scale is being used. If we look at the second set of research questions about principal buy-in and engagement, in our first year study, we estimated a typology of how principals arrayed across their enthusiasm and engagement in this process. And you see that the vast majority are either what we categorized as paradigm shift or highly enthusiastic. More than half of the principals were highly engaged in the evaluation system. In the second year study, we reconducted this analysis using a survey and quantitative methodology, and we found again that over half of the principals were highly engaged, which is a good sign given that the Danielson framework was a pretty major paradigm shift for principals and teachers. The next finding focuses on the distribution of ratings in comparison between tenured and non-tenured teachers. The reason why this is important for our study is that in the first year of our study, Chicago Public Schools only officially evaluates tenured teachers who are above the satisfactory level every other year. And it turned out that the Excellence in Teaching pilot and our study started in an off year for tenured teachers, meaning all of our analysis in our first year study was conducted primarily on probationary teachers in their first 3 years. So we were a little hesitant to release results on that with concern that the tenured teachers would look significantly different in terms of the distribution of ratings compared to non-tenured teachers. What you see here is that the distribution of ratings for non-tenured teachers in our first year study looks very similar to the distribution of ratings of tenured teachers in our second year study, which is good news for us as researchers, but not necessarily great news for the school system. So what you'll see is that the blue part of the stacked bar is the percentage of teachers with an unsatisfactory rating, 8% for the non-tenured versus 7% for the tenured. And then if you compare the like colors, you'll see the mix of proficient and basic, the mostly proficient, and the proficient and distinguished. So again, really important policy implications here. The last two findings focus on the developmental trajectories of principals, and this is something that we're undertaking using qualitative textual analysis. Part of our evaluation was to go into classrooms, go into observations and actually observe principals and teachers talking in their pre and post conferences. And what we did is textual analysis on the level of questions that principals asked in their conversations with teachers. We established a rubric with 3 levels, which you see up here, and you can read more clearly in your PowerPoints. Essentially, what we found is that principals do not have a good understanding about how to talk with their teachers about instruction. 65% of the questions they asked were very low level, 25% were level 2, and 10% were high level or level 3 questions. And again, this is an interesting parallel to some of the research findings about how teachers struggle with asking questions, meaningful questions of students in the classroom. We found that principals similarly struggle. And finally, finding 7, we did see development of principals across dimensions. We identified 3 dimensions: their understanding of the framework, their understandings of teacher evaluation more generally, and the level of reflection on teacher practice, so the nuance with which they understand instructional practice. And again, we had a rubric, level 1, 2, and 3. We found across principals 78% developed from year 1 to year 2 in their understanding of the framework, 57% developed in their understanding of the purposes of teacher evaluation, and 57% developed in their understanding of instructional practice. So it's hopeful that even within the first year, we see that principals developed across these dimensions. So I'll stop there, and again, I welcome more questions when we get to the panel portion.
What I'm talking about this morning is based on work I did with Tom Tock, then of Education Sector, report that came out a couple years ago and is available on the Education Sector website. It was done with support from the KnowledgeWorks Foundation. When we started this, we wanted to look at the issue of teacher evaluation, and it didn't take us long to realize how potentially important evaluation was, but how at the time under-observed and under-examined it was. It really represents, as I'm sure most of you know, it's an operationalization of what we believe teachers ought to be able to know and do in the classroom, to assess strengths and weaknesses along those standards, and then use that information for improvement. But most of the evidence we uncovered showed that this potential was being squandered. This report came out 2 years ago, and a lot has happened since then. the landscape is indeed evolving, as the title of this conference indicates, and the work that most of you are doing is a lot, shows a significant advance over traditional practice, but I still, I submit that it represents a minority, that most practice in most districts and states is still lagging behind. What we found in general was that there was little value in evaluation, that while it had this potential for being a significant driver of improvement in instruction, it wasn't being used that way. The evidence we saw at the time, this is out of date, 14 states required annual evaluation and half of large districts required annual evaluation. Now, those numbers have gone up in the past year, but they're not 50 states and not 100% of districts. But more to the point, the evaluations that did happen, there was a lot of evidence that they weren't very significant. They were mostly perfunctory. Teachers called them drive-bys. Principals would come in for a class period, observe, tick off items on a checklist that usually represented behavioral characteristics that had very little relationship to effective instruction. Things like, did the teacher start the lesson on time? Was the objective written on the blackboard, whiteboard? And then they would be rated satisfactory or unsatisfactory or needs improvement. We have an example in the report from North Dakota. Anyone here from North Dakota? But it's not very thoughtful or serious or a way to generate improvements. There was often no discussion afterwards with the teacher about goals for improvement or tying any kind of professional development to the results of the evaluation. And as we've seen again and again, Sara just pointed out what had happened in Chicago. Overwhelmingly, teachers were rated satisfactory. I don't know what the number ought to be, but just the fact that the rating is satisfactory or unsatisfactory shows that the evaluations were not done in a very thoughtful way. What are some alternatives? A lot of people are interested in looking at student achievement as a measure of teacher performance. There are a lot of problems with that. Test scores are problematic. As we've seen through this conference, fewer than half of teachers teach in tested grades and subjects. How do you measure student achievement for an art teacher or a second grade teacher? The tests that have been in place, the No Child Left Behind tests generally are low-level tests to measure low-level content. So if test scores show improvement on low-level content, it doesn't suggest whether teachers are in fact able to produce the kind of learning that the new Common Core standards, for example, suggest that students ought to learn. There's also the problem of teachers rightfully are concerned that they would be rewarded for having good students or penalized for having weaker students. Value-added scores are a way of getting around that problem by controlling for student background and student prior performance. But as research shows, value-added measures are not as precise as policymakers and the Los Angeles Times might want. So what are some alternatives? In the report, we call this a new model, and new is probably not accurate because these models have been around for some time, and they represent a lot of the kind of work that you're doing, things like the TAP system, Connecticut's BEST assessment for full licensure, the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And these systems share a number of characteristics. One, the Danielson framework is a good example of this. There are explicit standards for teacher practice. Those items in the framework represent things that teachers should be doing. They're clear to evaluators. That's one reason for the high rates of reliability that Sara just reported. They're also clear to teachers, so teachers know what's expected, what they can aim toward, and work toward that. There are also multiple measures of performance. It's not just a single drive-by, it's not just a single test score, it's a collection of evidence that shows whether teachers are actually meeting these standards or where they're coming up short. Multiple evaluations. In the case that Sara just reported on, there were 2 evaluations. In the TAP system, for example, there are 3 or 4 during the course of a year. So you see, you collect more evidence. You see teachers, if they're less able to game the system and put on a good show for the one evaluation. That you see regular performance. You can also see whether teachers improve over time, or in the case of the national board portfolios, you see a collection of work over a period of time. So you can see how teachers adjust their instruction based on student needs. And significantly, these systems are part of a system for teacher development. The goal is not gotcha, fire the bad teachers, but to use the information to develop instruction and improve teaching throughout the school. Why aren't these systems widespread? They've been around for a number of years. They still remain underused. A big factor is cost. The TAP system, for example, is about $600–700 per student. The national board portfolios are about $3,000 per teacher. In tight budgets, these are difficult expenses to meet, and it's no accident that a lot of the developments over the past couple of years have come with federal grants from the TIF program and from Race to the Top. Teacher unions have been reluctant to endorse these systems in many cases. A number of unions object to using test scores at all in evaluations. In other places, they've been supportive of evaluation, but less willing to impose consequences as a result of these evaluations. And the federal government has sent the wrong signals, and No Child Left Behind focused on the qualities that teachers bring into the classroom, their certification levels or their college coursework, but not on whether teachers were actually effective in the classroom. And you can see the power of the incentives the federal government provides, especially when dollars are attached. Just in the past year, what's happened with Race to the Top, when the federal government said, take a look at evaluations and determine whether teachers are effective, and we'll give you money for it. A lot of states said, okay. So we have some recommendations for systems going forward. The first is that a hybrid model seems to be appropriate. And again, there's a lot of evidence to support these models that they do, in fact, as Sara and John will also confirm, they do identify effective teachers and ineffective teachers, and they can provide information that teachers and principals need to improve instruction. But again, they measure both instructional practice and student achievement. Trained evaluators, very important. The principals or whoever evaluates the teachers need to understand the standards on which the teachers will be evaluated and be able to make appropriate judgments and evaluate teachers fairly and effectively. The evaluation should be evaluated also. Nobody's going to get it right the first time. We need to know what's working, what's not working, what needs to be changed. And finally, federal law should support these new systems. Right now, Race to the Top, 12 states are involved in that. A few states, in addition, have changed laws to reflect the goals of Race to the Top, but only with the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act can these systems really affect all states and all school districts. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm going to start with a little story about what my daughter's views are and teacher evaluation is. She was in 6th grade at the time. Her teacher was apparently up for tenure. And so the teacher was consequently observed 3 times throughout the school year. And by the 3rd time, my daughter came home and she said, "Mom, I just don't get it." She said the principal came in, they observed, and I'm telling you, it was nothing like it normally is when it's in the classroom. I told her, I said, maybe we can learn something from her. But I'm cautious because recently she was up. I congratulated her because she was up for contention for most likely to succeed in 8th grade promotion ceremony, and she said she was disappointed because she wanted best hair. It's going to be a lot of years in front of me, isn't it? Yesterday, Todd showed us an example of a teacher and asked us at the end, she showed us a video clipping, and asked us at the end, is this an effective teacher? And we were all pretty quiet. Now, granted, he didn't ask us to jump up and yell out the answer, but we were pretty quiet. And I found myself pause for a minute, and I kind of reflected on that. I'm like, you know, is it an effective teacher? What is everybody else in the room going to think? And I think that's the challenge that's in front of us, and that what we're talking about in these days that we've been here. How do we know? Are we starting to question what we know or what we thought we knew about what an effective teacher looks like? And the real challenge is determining what that is and then determining measurements that are reliable and valid, which is really the point of what we're talking about in the next within these days that we've been here. I want you to take just about 30 seconds here and just entertain me for a minute. With your elbow partner or in your head or on a note, I want you to jot down the answer to this question. If you were to walk into a classroom and to observe an effective teacher, what would you see or hear? With your elbow partner or just jotting it down, if you walked into a classroom and you were to observe an effective teacher, what would you see or hear in that classroom? All right. Clearly, we could talk forever about this. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand and tell me what those would look like, but I do want you to think for a moment. You've just listed some things that were what you would see or hear for an effective teacher. Let me ask you this. Would that be different if it were a special education teacher? Think in your head, would it be different? Or should it be different? I see yeses, I see nos. That's fair. And would there be things on there that we would want to look for differently if it were a special ed teacher? Questions to think about as I go on in the presentation today. I get the opportunity to talk to you about a brief that we at the TQ Center put out regarding the challenges of evaluating special education and ELL specialist teachers. Some of the challenges that we have in that is that there's limited research, which is a lot of what we've heard in the last couple of days. There is limited research. There's a little bit of research on credentials, whether or not they have experience, whether or not they're certified, and how that makes an impact. There is a new study out by Fang, it's not really that new, but a study out by Fang and Sass that takes a look at value-added scores for students that are in a general education classroom, showing that students perform better in reading and math if the teacher is certified in special education. But research on evaluating special education teachers is rather limited. Few evaluation systems exist right now that do address the unique features of a special education teacher. And measuring that achievement growth is very challenging when you're talking about a special education teacher. The small student numbers that are commonly associated with this population of teachers makes it difficult. The student mobility, moving from one place to the next, also makes it difficult to get value-added scores. We haven't done a whole lot of research on using accommodations. What does that mean for a value-added score? We have several students that are on alternate assessment, alternate standards. Again, what are we going to do about value-added scores for these students? And then my favorite, how do we handle teachers teaching in a co-teaching situation? How do we attribute teacher effects on those particular students? And then, of course, all those things lead to challenges with differentiated compensation. How do we compute compensation for these teachers when we have all these issues with it? We set out to do this brief to help states and regions that were really designing or retooling their teacher evaluation system. And what we wanted to do was to identify what those challenges were, determine the current state, what's exactly going on out there in terms of teacher evaluation or special education teacher evaluation. We wanted to identify promising practices and then ultimately provide guidance to states and regions and districts that are charging down this road. To do this, we reviewed policy, we completed a survey, and then we had a series of interviews with state and local practitioners and researchers. We designed the survey with the Council for Exceptional Children and several national experts, and it was a state and local survey. Our respondent pool, we specifically designed it to be special education administrators because we really wanted to hear the voices of folks who have a lot of experience in supervising, mentoring, and leading this population of teachers. We had over a little over 1,100 respondents with this particular survey. Within the survey, we asked about current practice, but we also wanted to gather the collective opinions of the experts, if you will. So we had several statements with Likert rating scale to give us an idea of what their thoughts were on teacher evaluation. I'm going to specifically focus on that for this morning's presentation. For this afternoon, we're presenting again, and we're going to get a little bit more into what are some examples of what we found. One of the questions we asked were opinions about special education teacher evaluation, and I'm going to start at the bottom here. As you can see here, 84% of our respondents agreed or strongly agreed that special education teachers are required to have knowledge, skills, and expertise that general education teachers are not. So 84% of our respondents really thought that these teachers have to have different kind of skill sets than the general education teachers would need to have. The second item there, 32%, we were quite mixed on whether or not special education teachers should be evaluated the same as general education teachers. And honestly, when I went into this, I wasn't sure which side on the fence I stood on. And honestly, I could argue both points here today. Obviously, it's good to have one system because it's simpler, easier to manage, fairer, all those reasons. But then we also have to consider as well, why do we certify our teachers differently? Why do we train them differently if we're not looking at anything different when we're observing them in the classroom? So clearly, I could argue both sides. And the last thing, and this to me was the most intriguing or the most exciting thing that we found from this work, was that 92% of our respondents felt that the special educators' use of evidence-based practices should be a component of teacher evaluation. When we looked at, and we looked at a lot of different states and districts and what they're doing to evaluate teachers, what we noticed that most of the evaluation measurements or tools that they were using really focused on meeting the needs of diverse learners, which was a bit vague in many situations. And it didn't necessarily hone in on the special skills a special education teacher might need to use, like facilitating an IEP meeting, working on behavioral management, those type of things. And it really didn't focus in on those evidence-based practices that we know are proven to help students with disabilities achieve. We do know what works, somewhat, for the most part. We have robust effect sizes in certain instructional strategies for special education teachers. We're going to talk a lot more about this afternoon, but I just wanted to make the point that we do know some things about how to work with students with disabilities and at-risk students to help move their bar on student achievement. And so that's something that we really do need to focus on when we're considering how to evaluate our teachers. Federal policy is really shown us that student achievement needs to be a big part of teacher evaluation. So we wanted to ask our experts how they felt about using student achievement as part of the evaluation process. As you can see here, 60% either agreed or strongly agreed that achievement gain should be a component of teacher evaluation. Only 21% felt that we needed to use standardized test scores as part of that in the evaluation process. Now, my thought is that we've got a lot of argument on whether or not our students can really do well, perform well on those tests, et cetera, but only 21% of our respondents indicated that we should really use that as part of the evaluation process. And honestly, this next point was the one that surprised me the most on the survey. 73% of our respondents indicated that they'd like to see progress on the IEP as a component of teacher evaluation. Now, honestly, it scares me a little bit because we have really good IEPs and we have not so good IEPs. And that's not what IEPs are designed to do. But I also understand where they're coming from. What are our choices here? We laid out standardized assessment and everybody feels like that's not necessarily where we want to go. So let's lean towards IEPs. We do have a couple places that do student growth kind of measures, one of which being Austin, which you'll hear about later this afternoon, using student learning objectives where they develop measurable goals within those. And then we also have a district that uses the IEP and factors the results on the IEP into their evaluation. I just want to make a point, we'll talk more about this afternoon, but my point is that it's very, very contingent on the quality of these goals and the quality of the IEP, and making sure that whatever measures are being used are valid and reliable. If that's the path that folks have decided to go down. We also asked about evaluators. We know a lot of contention comes up when the evaluators, the people being evaluated are being evaluated by somebody that they don't feel can make legitimate decisions about their performance. They don't have the experience in that area. 77% of our respondents indicated they'd like to see specialized training, and 61% said that they should have experience in special education. 60% of our folks indicated that they do require training for evaluators. Only 12% of those indicated that it was specialized for special ed. We heard a lot yesterday from Jason about the DC Impact Program, and I mentioned this here. I think everybody kind of heard what components are part of that program and how they're measured. But what I liked about this program was that they do have a differentiated system for special ed teachers. Because they're not using value-added scores, they don't have any percentage with that. But with non-value-added, they're looking at 10%, and you can see the percentages on down there. But they did add two components, the IEP quality and the IEP timeliness. Really starting to take a look at, are they meeting compliance in timelines? Are they developing quality IEP goals? There's rubrics to evaluate that. And I'm going to conclude with just a couple of recommendations, and if you walk away from anything from this presentation today with me, is if you are designing something, make sure that you have special educators at the table. They can give you some knowledge or some input as to how to evaluate or how to consider these pockets of teachers. I was thrilled. I think it was Idaho, maybe, yesterday? Yeah, that had a special education director here with them. Utah, sorry. Utah had a special education director with them. But it's really important to make sure that they're at the table. If you're identifying a common framework for effective teaching, you may want to differentiate for special ed educators as appropriate. There may be no need to differentiate, and in many situations there's probably not. Good teaching is good teaching, but there may be some issues or some areas that we want to differentiate to some degree. And then integrate that evidence-based practices piece for students with disabilities into the evaluation models. Ensure that evaluators are trained in the area. And then in addition to, or in some situations where there's the absence of standardized assessments, value-added scores, consider incorporating other reliable evidence of teachers' contributions to student learning, which would be very important for all teachers. And lastly, I just want to say that when considering your teacher evaluation process, and I think I heard somebody talk about it yesterday, and I can't remember exactly what university she was from, but make sure you're including your teacher preparation programs. Because truly, if we're going to be evaluating these teachers once they come out against this paradigm or this process, teacher educators need to be in on that process to making sure that we're arming the teachers with the skills necessary to perform well for us. Thank you.
This is joint work with Tom Kane and Eric Taylor, who's now a PhD student at Stanford, and Amy Wooten. It's a 2-year project in Cincinnati funded by the Joyce Foundation. And what we're going to talk about today is a project where we started out by saying, as teacher evaluation gets more important, and as we ramp up classroom observations and get that done better, then we're relying on these frameworks. The Danielson framework is one that professional educators say is good teaching. But most of this stuff has had weak to no validation about whether what professional educators think is good teaching is good teaching in the sense that it actually impacts student achievement. And being an economist type, me and Tom are, skeptical of that kind of stuff. We want to know, well, what's the empirical evidence on that? So we wanted to try to bring to bear some empirical evidence on are these kinds of frameworks, the things that observers are looking at, actually related to student achievement growth. But we wanted to take it a step further. We wanted to say, if we can get rich enough data, can we actually identify specific classroom practices that seem to be more important than others in promoting student achievement growth? So that's essentially what we were trying to do, and we did it in Cincinnati. Why Cincinnati? Well, Cincinnati is a school district that's had a really rigorous and robust evaluation system for 10 years. It's based on the Danielson framework. They've developed it over the years, but the system, I'll talk about it more in a minute, but it's a system that's mature, it's been used, and Cincinnati is a district where they don't use value-added measures at this point, but they had the data that allowed us to construct value-added measures for teachers. So they gave us the data that allowed us to match teachers to classrooms and students to tests and essentially construct student achievement growth measures for teachers who had undergone evaluation through these 10 years of their teacher evaluation system. So it's a district that had the kind of data that we needed, and there aren't many of those around. Because as Bob talked about, there are very few districts that have had serious evaluation for any length of time. And you're going to see that even with 10 years, we only end up with about 207 teachers that we can use in our study. So the data demands to do this are fairly fierce. Cincinnati was one place that we could do it. How did we do it? Well, worked with the district that did not mind having researchers in and worked with researchers. And the main thing that we did was to take their 10 years worth of teacher evaluations that were in pasteboard boxes, hire a team of retired teachers to code those up electronically. It took about a year to do that because for each teacher there are 4 evaluations per year in their system, and all the information was there that we needed, but it was on paper, and so we had to get that done. And then matching that to student achievement data and matching teachers to classes, et cetera, all the things that you have to do to construct value-added measures. Okay, so what did we learn? This is previewing the end of the story. We did find that the classroom practices as measured by their teacher evaluation system are highly correlated with student achievement growth. So the things that they are measuring by looking in the classroom are actually measuring things that lead to student achievement growth. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we learned is that at least when it comes to promoting math scores, that classroom management trumps instructional practices. And like Jason, I'm a former middle school math teacher of 8 years, and when we went into this and I was reading through the Danielson rubrics, I thought, this is going to be neat because we're going to show that knowing your chops as a teacher is really important. And when it came out the other way around and classroom management was so important, I was really sort of disappointed. And about the time I was disappointed and about the time we were getting our results, the New York Times Magazine article on Doug Lemov, How to Build a Good Teacher, came out. And Doug Lemov's standpoint of all the things that he looks at, his, I think, 49 measures of teaching, his typology. Up there at the top is classroom management, and there was a quote in there that sort of woke my eyes up as a former teacher and now as a researcher, where Doug says, if you can't get a 5th grader to stop what they're doing and look you in the eye while you're telling them something, it doesn't matter how good you know your math, you're not going to get anything taught. So a little light went onto my head, and I thought, okay. And I thought it's kind of neat, actually, that now we brought some empirical evidence to back up what Lemov is saying. So we'll get to that evidence in just a moment. Okay, so Cincinnati's TES system. We're going to look at 2 domains out of the 4 domains that the Danielson framework. They use the Danielson framework. It's tweaked just a little bit, but it's basically the Danielson framework. We looked at 2 domains out of the 4 that are in the Danielson framework, and they're the two domains that have to do with classroom observations, and that's classroom management and teaching practices. All right, there are 8 standards within these two domains. All right, and we're going to look at one standard in detail in just a moment. What we thought we would do going in is that we would be able to tell Cincinnati, you know, right now you're implicitly weighting all of these 8 standards equally. When you evaluate your teachers and at the end of the year you give your teachers a score, you're implicitly weighting them equally. And if what you cared about was student achievement growth as measured by test scores, an equal weighting across these things might not be optimal. You know, one thing that a teacher does might be more important than another thing that a teacher does when it comes to promoting student test score growth. And this is what, if you remember, Jason was talking about yesterday that Washington wants to do with its 9 standards, that they're getting data now and they want to figure out which of those are most important. Jason and I talked about this last night, and I think they're going to run into the same problem we did, although they do have more data because they have more, it's a bigger school district. These 8 standards, and I have no doubt that Jason's 9 standards are going to be highly correlated. If a teacher's good in one, if they get a good score in one, they tend to get good scores in all the others. So this high correlation does not allow you to tease out and tell the district this one's more important than this one and this one. So what we had to do was a statistical process to see that under these 8 standards, what are maybe some latent teacher characteristics that they're really measuring. And we came up with 3. The first one is just overall teaching practice, so it's sort of the average across these 8 standards. The next one was a contrast between how well you manage your classroom and your actual instructional practices. And the third then was a little more nuanced. It was about, do you engage your students via questioning and discourse and sort of Socratic learning, if you will, although I use that term loosely. I know some educators will cringe the way I use that, but sort of Socratic teaching versus a more standards-based, criterion-based teaching. So those are the 3 principal components, if you will, that we had to work with. All right, so the key thing here in Cincinnati is that teachers undergo evaluation in their cycle. They get evaluated once every 5 years. If you're new, you're going to get evaluated. You're going to get evaluated at tenure, but once you're a tenured teacher, you're going to get evaluated once every 5 years. During that cycle, you get 4 evaluations. 3 by trained evaluators, and these are seriously trained evaluators. They're taken out of the classroom for 3 years to be an evaluator. They're lead teachers. They're out for 3 years just doing evaluations. They're trained to do this. 3 of your evaluations will be by these lead teacher evaluators. 1 will be by your building administrator. The first evaluation of the year is announced. By announced, they mean we're going to tell you the week that will come. We're not telling you the day. The other 3 are completely unannounced. All right? So we have the data from all of these evaluations. So here's an example of what standard 3.1, and this is in the teaching practices domain, and it says the teacher communicates standards-based instructional objectives, high expectations, instructor directions, procedures, and assessment criteria. All right? The teacher at the end of the year is going to get a score on 3.1. But that score is generated by the teacher's score on all of these bulleted items that go with that. And all of these bulleted items are scored 4 different times during the year. And so at the end of the year, the evaluator sits down, gathers all this information, and in a process that's not exactly averaging up all these bullet level scores, because they can bring other evidence into it, they give them 1 score. And that's the only thing that's kept electronically is your standard score. So we could have gotten that. But we drilled down and got all of the scores at the bullet level for every evaluation for a teacher. And that's what we use because there's more variation, there's more information there. So that's what we're going to use. And what I have here is the language in standard 3.1 for the language that would be required to score at the proficient level. Above basic, below distinguished. And so the first one, the first bullet, under this, the teacher communicates. Well, one of the ways the teacher communicates is the teacher writes lesson plans with clear and measurable standards-based instructional objectives. I should have looked it up this morning. I didn't. I'm guessing that language for a basic level would read something like, teacher writes lesson plans with standards-based instructional objectives. So they write the lesson plans, they have the standards in there, but they're not clear and measurable. All right? So that's important because it's going to give the teacher information back that can be used for that teacher to become better. Okay? All right. So here are the results, and I want you to focus on this column right here. So what we find, and this is for math scores, what we find is that a teacher's ability, her overall ability, so this is across all the 8 standards, a 1-unit change in that leads to student test score growth of 1/10 of a standard deviation. And a 1-unit change would mean going from being a teacher at, for example, the proficient level to being a teacher at the basic level. That's a 1-unit change. Is associated with 1/10 of a standard deviation increase in student test scores over the course of the year. So that's the first, that's this idea that we've done we think a rigorous job of validating that what they are measuring out there is actually related to student test score growth. The second thing is that take 2 teachers that are both, for example, at the proficient level. If one of those teachers is better at classroom management than at instructional practices relative to the other teacher, then that teacher is going to promote even higher test score growth. And here's the way to think about this relative. Take 2 teachers whose overall score is 3. A teacher who got that by having a 3.2 in classroom management and a 2.8 in instructional practice will generate higher test score growth than a teacher whose average score is 3 because she was a 3 on both. Okay? All right, so let's put some ideas behind, how big is this? What this means is that a student that started the year at the 50th percentile, if that teacher was assigned to a top quartile teacher in terms of overall instructional practices, that student would gain 2 percentile points higher in math relative to if that same student had been assigned to a lower quartile teacher. All right? Now, all right, how big is that? Well, it doesn't seem like much, only 2 percentile points. But the standard deviation in total teacher effect, and this is, if you remember what Jason said yesterday, that if you're assigned to a top quartile teacher versus a bottom quartile teacher for 4 years in a row, you close the black-white achievement gap. We find similar total teacher effects in Cincinnati relative to what everyone else does. And what they are is that the standard deviation in total teacher effects is about 0.12, which means that the effect of being assigned to a top quartile teacher versus a lower quartile teacher would move you up 12 percentage points if you start at the 50th percentile. So the total teacher effect is 12 percentile points, and of that we find that 2 percentile points is captured in these classroom observation measures. So it's a non-trivial portion of what teachers are doing are actually being captured. And then finally, there's this idea that in math, at least, and again, this is math in 3 through 8th grades. This may not hold for an algebra teacher or for a geometry teacher, but in math in 3 through 8th grades, the ability to manage your classroom is more important than the kind of exact instructional practices that you bring. The other point is that this is also sort of where Cincinnati is, right? It may be that in a different district that is at some other place on some achievement scale that instructional practice might be more important than classroom management. So that gives you some idea of sort of the heavy lift that's going to be required to really put some firm numbers around the evaluations that are sort of blooming around the nation today. Thanks.
I want to start off with a question I have for our panel, and then I hope others will be asking questions. My question is basically, are these various systems of teacher evaluation with which these researchers are familiar good enough for high-stakes personnel decisions? And I want to flesh that out just a little bit. By good enough, I mean good enough to be seriously employed for this purpose. So I don't have in mind that we identify a very small number of teachers who are doing harm to students and we get rid of them, but that we identify a substantial number of teachers who are just not very good, and our chance of going out and hiring somebody better is pretty high. Okay, so are they good enough for that kind of decision? Or on the other hand, identifying teachers who are so strong that we want to offer them very substantial increases in pay, not just little modest token amounts of money, but substantial differences in compensation to encourage them to stay in these schools. So those kinds of high-stakes personnel decisions on a significant scale. Okay? Now, if these systems are not good enough for that purpose, then my question is, well, what do we get from them? Okay? And what is the evidence that there's still a good reason to be using them? And if they are good enough to be used for this purpose, then are we likely to see them used that way? Or perhaps the way I should pose it is, what do we need to do to promote their use for these sorts of decisions? So however you'd like to respond to that.
I'm happy to go first and take a stab at that. I would say that the Chicago research in particular has given us hope that I think there is most hope at the top and the bottom in terms of using these tools to make the types of decisions that you're talking about. And I think using a combination of observations with a reliable and valid tool such as the Danielson framework in combination with value add scores, we see the clearest relationship between observation ratings and value add scores for teachers who are at the top of the distribution and teachers who are at the bottom of the distribution. In terms of value add, where it gets a little trickier is for the teachers, the 60 to 75% of teachers who fall sort of in the middle range. So that being said, I would say that we're getting close to finding the right kind of combination of tools to feel confident that we can make good, fair decisions about how to identify low-performing teaching and confident decisions at the top end of the scale about how to identify really exemplary teaching practice. Now that being said, there's always a caveat because researchers always have caveats. I would say that one of the problems with teacher evaluation systems nationwide, and this was referred to by several of the members of our panel, is that we don't have the kind of nuance in general that we need in teacher evaluation systems. I don't think that it's enough or fair to make those decisions just based on observations or just based on observations and value add together. I think it's one of the strengths of the DC model that does have a more nuanced viewpoint on this and using multiple types of data and data sources and data points to make these decisions. But I do think that if we use a combination of value add, of a good tool, of school level value add, that we can make fair decisions. I would argue, yes, we can make fair decisions, particularly around exemplary and low performing teachers. What's much more problematic is the majority of teachers who fall somewhere in the middle.
I would just add that that's true even without these types of systems. There was a study by Brian Jacob of looking at principals' ability to identify teacher effectiveness, and they found that the principals were pretty good at identifying the top 10% and the bottom 10%, but it was this vast area in the middle that is hard to differentiate among, and what these systems offer the prospect of doing is being able to make these finer gradations, these more nuanced determinations that can provide more information to teachers about what they need to do to become more effective.
I just want to add one more thing about the purpose of teacher evaluation systems, because I think your question implies a really important question about why are we conducting teacher evaluation. Sometimes the assumption is that primarily we need teacher evaluation to identify and sanction low-performing teachers. But the problem with the fact that these systems don't differentiate among the majority of teachers who fall in the middle is that there should be a developmental aspect to teacher evaluation that I think a lot of times gets overlooked. So if our purpose is to develop our teaching core, if that's one of the purposes of teacher evaluation, then we need to get really serious about figuring out how to differentiate those teachers, understand what they know and need to learn, and design professional development and supports in order to develop them.
One of the things that we saw, however, is that while Cincinnati is like most districts, and Cincinnati was one of the districts that was highlighted in the widget effect, in that most of the Cincinnati teachers in their TES system score 3s or 4s. But when we look at our data, where we're using the bullet level information, among those 3s and 4s, there's a non-trivial amount of variation there that the district is not using. And that's probably true for most districts. And so it's not clear whether the ability to not distinguish in the middle is a function of, evaluators just can't tell that, at that nuance level, or whether it's a function of the scoring system that they're using. So my take on your question, Dale, is that it has a fairly, a non-trivial normative component to it. And my response would be, we find what we think is a pretty rigorous study show that these classroom evaluators are identifying classroom practices that are indeed related to student test score growth.
Good morning, Carla Stevens from Houston. My question is to you all, but also I guess this kind of relates to all of the different panels that we've had here and the things that I've heard about some of the evaluation systems that are in effect. It seems to me that the presentations have been on the effectiveness of teachers kind of as a whole, in the sense that they're almost like they're departmentalized teachers, that they are really effective in everything or they are not effective in everything. What have you found in your systems that you have studied where it differentiates if a teacher is really effective in teaching math but not effective in teaching reading? It seems to me that we keep talking about highly effective teachers or not effective teachers when maybe they can be effective in one thing but not effective in another. Have you found anything that can differentiate that?
Our data is not rich enough for that, and it ideally could be, but in the evaluations it does not state whether the teacher was teaching. So, this is going to be elementary teachers and middle school teachers. It doesn't state for the elementary teachers whether they were being observed teaching math or reading or a combination that period. We can pull out the middle school teachers, but our sample size gets so small that we can't say anything meaningful if we just use 6th, 7th, and 8th grade teachers. So it's possible to get at what you want, but the data demands, again, I think are going to be pretty fierce.
And we have a similar data restriction in that the vast majority of the observations from our study are in English literacy and math classrooms. But we don't, when you start breaking down into things like science, social studies, we have such small numbers of observations that it's hard to look. But I would just add too, and this is an important aspect of your question, that we have, I think, more certainty about what we're seeing in elementary classrooms than we do in high school. I think there's an assumption, the Chicago pilot and the Chicago study is only focused on elementary schools at this point. And some early work that the consortium did on the High School Transformations Initiative in Chicago Public Schools, where we used Danielson to look at high school classrooms, suggests that the distributions of ratings in high school classrooms is significantly different from elementary schools, significantly lower, almost across the board, but also even different in terms of the way that the components of the Danielson framework array sort of hierarchically. So I think we have a lot more to learn about how instruction differs in these grade level contexts, middle and high school contexts, and across subject areas. I agree with you that that's a huge hole in our understanding right now.
Let me just add that we had a tantalizing finding that it was tantalizing, and it helped us, I think, our work passed the sniff test, if you will. That third component, which is a contrast between teaching using sort of a Socratic style versus teaching more from a standards-based criteria. The only place that third component ever showed up is when we sliced our sample out and looked at just middle school teachers versus just elementary school teachers. And for middle school teachers, on the reading score, that component finally sort of had a positive coefficient, but because the sample size was so small, it was not significant. But if you think about it, that may be the place where it's most important to be able to teach that way, is middle school language arts. And it did show up there. But again, we could get at that. You just need a much bigger sample size than we had. And think about this, we had 10 years worth of observation data.
Mark Bounds from South Carolina. This really kind of extends that question about teacher fit and whether or not a teacher that may be very effective in a suburban area may, when the same grade level kids get a substandard rating in a different area. And so as we think about teacher distribution and putting their teachers in the right place to be successful, I mean, are any of your research beginning to look at teacher effectiveness based on the context of where they might be teaching?
Well, of course, the value add analysis does take into account all kinds of contextual factors, which is one of the reasons why it is a powerful measure, even if flawed. But I would say the observation component of that, we have less control over the way in which that is used contextually. Certainly it helps in our study that our observers do observations across all the different contexts within the city of Chicago, but it doesn't get at your question of the differences between suburban and urban contexts. And we definitely do see that the ratings are systematically lower in the most disadvantaged contexts, which could mean that the observers are actually unfairly judging something as the context influence as part of the teacher's practice. So I think there's still, I agree with you, there's still work to be done in that area.
This is for John. One issue that's kind of concerns me with this line of research, looking at non-experimental research, looking at teacher behaviors and value added, is that, of course, the teacher behaviors may be endogenous. And of course, that's what ed schools claim they teach teachers to do, that they respond to what the kids are doing in the classroom and adopt their behaviors accordingly. So it's not really exogenous variation in these behaviors. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And I noticed you had one column in there that had a teacher fixed effect, which meant that you're looking at how the teacher herself changed over time, and sort of, and it was, and the coefficient jumped a lot. So if you could just comment on those things.
Yeah, sure. So you could work, we worry about that. We also worry about non-random sorting of students to teachers. We try to deal with the latter using school fixed effects, and that, that helps a lot. And to get at your question, we did want to look within teacher. The reason that, so we have that in there, the reason that it's not, it's talked about in the paper, that I didn't have time to talk about today, but we have to have teachers that have 2 years of TES observation, and it's very small. But what we see there is it certainly doesn't go away. It gets bigger, and I mean, I don't know what to say other than that. Is that we deal with it the best we can, and you'd want, I think you'd want to do a teacher fixed effects model. We just don't have enough data to do more than we could, but the effect that we find didn't go away when we look within teacher.
Well, it's kind of interesting why the teacher changed what they were doing.
Yes, in my role, one of the things that I do is I coordinate professional development, continuing education, and I'm the go-to person for our PG&A, which is our professional growth and accountability program based on Charlotte Danielson's model. So my thing is I'm always in kind of a tension spot with administration because I think that we should be spending our PD dollars on looking at where the teachers are low in their teacher evaluation and bringing in training for those areas. And they're saying, no, we need to do writing across the curriculum and math out of the box, and we need to do differentiated instruction and those kind of isolated trainings, scattershoot, or hitting large groups. Where would you put your PD dollars if you were in a small rural district that only gets $6,000 per student?
If you got the same results that we did, you'd put it across sort of general classroom general teaching practices to start with, and then your next PD dollars you'd put into classroom management over helping teachers get better teaching chops, if you believe the data.
I'd like to return to these questions about the evaluation focused on content and to urge you in your research to focus on this very closely, because my experience as a school inspector, I trained in the UK, you probably recognize the accent, but For over 15 years of our experience through inspecting over 35,000 schools there, we come to realize the crucial importance of inspecting what we would call the subject or the content. So much so that reviewers who go in to evaluate a classroom, who go in to do a classroom observation, must be subject specialists in that area. It's crucially important with a 6th or 7th grade, 5th grade teacher of mathematics to know whether they know the math that they're teaching. So, you know, and I'm quite surprised, unfortunately I had to miss some of your presentation, I'm quite surprised by the last finding in math, teachers' ability to manage a classroom is more important than instructional practices. I'm sure you've done the research, I'm sure it's right, but I'm quite surprised by that. That wouldn't be our experience. So what I'm really saying here is that there is a wealth of experience which actually has developed instruments, tools, observation forms, which are very subject specific. And I was saying in a group yesterday, I remember my training as an inspector, where my mentor inspector looked at my observation form and said, yeah, very good, Peter, you've observed a lot about the classroom management and the culture of the classroom and the teacher's experience and expertise. What subject was she teaching? I can't tell what was being taught. The inference being that if you can't tell what was being taught from a form that's come out of an observation, really you've not gone deep enough. So I really want to sort of reinforce the issues that are being brought up in this part of the debate.
If I just want to comment on that, the TAP system, for example, the study came out of the National Center here a couple of years ago, found that it was less successful in high school in identifying teacher effectiveness than it was in elementary school, and that may be because the evaluators are not necessarily linked to the subject that they're evaluating, and it may be that they need that, particularly in high school, there needs to be much more attention to the content and the content-based, the pedagogical content knowledge as a way of evaluating the teacher in order to distinguish their abilities than might be true in lower grades.
I think there's another level to this in terms of the tools that we use, figuring out whether or not the tools that we're using are fair in high school settings. I don't think that the Danielson framework in particular has undergone rigorous enough testing to see if it actually is a reliable, fair tool for judging teacher performance at the high school level, both because of the content-specific nature of high school practice, but also just the difference in overall management of a high school classroom versus an elementary self-contained classroom. So I think that there are two levels to this. I mean, certainly there's evaluating on the content and having content expertise for that person in the classroom. Then there's the second idea that you have to have the right tool to be able to do that in a fair and consistent way.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with either of those points, but I would say that I've inspected thousands of elementary schools and observed thousands of elementary school lessons and been dismayed by seeing elementary school teachers teaching quite well in terms of their pedagogy, but teaching the wrong thing, actually teaching misinformation. I've made my point.
In Cincinnati, they try really hard to match the subject-specific evaluator to the teacher. I know there's some folks from Cincinnati here, and you may have some more information on this, but they work really hard to send. If they're going to be evaluating a middle school math teacher, they want the evaluator to come from math, and same for science, et cetera. And like you, I thought that I was surprised at the results as well, but the data told me differently, Peter.
I'm going to just speak to that a little bit with my special ed hat, and I know that's not content specific, but what we found when we were looking at different people using observation instruments, we asked the question in the survey, do you modify that instrument or do you use a separate instrument for special education teachers? And right now, I guess I can't remember the exact number, but I believe it was around 12% that said, yes, we use something different. Well, then I started to probe into that a little bit and start to call some of those folks and say, okay, let me see this instrument that's different. What does it look like? And what it came really down to is that they modified the instrument but it was really up to the evaluator to modify it. What most of the directors told me was that I just modified the narrative portion of the observation instrument, which is all good and well if you are a knowledgeable educator and you know what you're looking for in terms of special ed or content or whatever when you're writing out those narrative comments. So it was highly dependent on the knowledge of the person who was doing the evaluation, and I'm not so sure I was comfortable with that, because then again, if you're having a principal or somebody else come in that doesn't have that knowledge, are they going to know what to look for? We almost need a rubric that delineates exactly what they would be looking for so that it could target some of that examination. Just my thoughts.
Hi, Paul Helder, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have a question. I want to make sure that I have this information correct. I've been taking my notes here. And I'm wondering if you can help me out, particularly, I believe it's Sara, is it, from Chicago? Okay, because we're kind of neighbors, and it's going to be, well, what does Chicago do because of the national stuff and everything like this? You mentioned that the value-added system that you're using can be used very effectively to ID the really high and really low performing teachers in the classroom, but that middle range 75%, you know, it's very nuanced and needs some work. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean what
Okay.
I'm saying really is that the relationship between the ratings and the student outcomes are clearest at the top and the bottom of teachers. And I'll just add to that that's not just the Chicago story. That's a very common value add story across the localities that are using this as a tool. And I think another layer to this is that a lot of teachers don't have standardized test scores attached to them. So you're already talking in most places about a very small group of teachers that you can do this analysis to begin with.
Okay. And you had mentioned that this appears to probably work best, or at least where your concentration is. I'm not sure which one that was for elementary, but maybe not for high or middle school. Could you clarify that?
I just think I don't know whether or not, our research has been so focused on elementary schools, and a lot of the research across the nation has primarily been focused on elementary schools. So I guess I would just argue that we don't know how it'll apply at the middle and high school level.
Okay.
And John, I know you had middle and high schools in your sample, so you could probably speak more to those relationships.
Just middle schools.
Middle schools.
Yeah.
So high schools, as usual, are the sticking point. It's tough. I don't think we should assume that the relationships that we see at elementary and middle school, that we'll necessarily see those at the high school level.
Okay. All right, that's helpful. I guess then, when your colleague, is it Robert, to your right, he had kind of mentioned that most building principals could identify the top 10% and bottom 10%. We've been hearing for a while that this is a very complicated kind of a system, and that's what appeals to me. I'm a systems dork. That's true. I guess what I'm coming away with, though, is if it requires a dramatic change. I think one of the speakers earlier mentioned that one of the things that they would do is essentially make reductions in salary and benefits to sustain a program that includes this merit pay based on value added and things of this nature. If all of this is done, and it is a complicated process, and we would need consultants, and we would need help to come in and set it up, and we would need all this stuff, and the ultimate data that we get isn't significantly more reliable than what the principal already knows, and we're not including high school, maybe middle school, K through 3, help me understand what we get for this, because I'm interested, and I'm trying to figure it out.
Well, I think the question is what's the purpose of this? And if the purpose is just to identify highly effective teachers and poorly effective teachers, then we can do that. But if the purpose is to provide a broader range of information about what teacher strengths and weaknesses are, tie professional development to that, then I think you need a more sophisticated system.
Okay, so it would be based around then trying to improve perhaps performance for that bottom 10% that we can identify.
Or the
Conceivably.
60th
Okay.
percent.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, it's really top 20 and bottom 20. That's 40%, and that's very
Okay.
important. And the fact that you can only do that reliably with teacher effects maps onto what happens with other personnel evaluation frameworks. We're very good at identifying the top and bottom 15, 20% across a variety of applications in business, education, et cetera, and all the noise is in the middle.
Sure. Everybody knows who the tall kid in class is. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Okay.
But I think the next step, and I think our current tools for evaluating teachers are not specific enough about practices that make a big difference in achievement. For example, one of the effect sizes we're citing, and we'll talk about this afternoon, has to do with progress monitoring. Good progress monitoring with feedback to teachers and students leading to instructional changes has an effect size that's very substantial that is not, for example, captured on the Charlotte Danielson kinds of observation procedures. And I think as we go forward, we'll see more specifics added to the effective instructional practices, which in turn, I think, will provide better differentiation.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Denise Miller. I'm an EDD student at Peabody. I was just having a question. I'm going to maybe make this up. Okay. I had a question. To me, a lot of these decisions are based on the results of ELA and math test scores. And to me, the point of school is supposed to be learning. I've had a lot of students in New York that maybe didn't perform very well on the test, but could articulate their learning, teachers that really push their students to learn, and making these decisions on money, on teacher training, based on ELA and math test scores exclusively. I'm a little concerned about how that translates to the broader system or the broader goals of education, especially because I've seen entire school systems, basically all of our PD is going to go to ELA and math, and special ed teachers and the science teachers all sitting in after-school sessions only focused on ELA and math training. So I'm just sort of curious if they're doing any more portfolio assessments of all teacher outcomes, or if any of the money is sort of going there.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I share your concern, and I would add another layer to it, which is standardized tests are a very blunt instrument for doing the things that we're doing with them. So it isn't just, my concern isn't just that it's just English language arts test scores and math test scores. It's also standardized test scores themselves are not necessarily, in my opinion, the right way to develop teachers. We could learn a lot more from diagnostic and use of diagnostic and formative assessments if we're interested in actually understanding what teachers are teaching students and what teachers still need to learn. So it's not a response to your question, but rather I'm just layering another concern that I think is similar on top of that.
Also, an added question was just this idea of diverse learners that you brought up. How much work are they doing to sort of further layer that very broad categorization? Because I had overage students, ELL students that used to be ELL but now have been converted out of ELL, students that used to be in special ed but are now not special ed, and a lot of the research, it's just these kids are categorically special ed, or these kids are categorically ELL, and when that translates to a real school environment, kids are both, kids used to be something but now they're not, and all of those learning situations come with the kids. So I just kind of wondered what kind of ties they have to kids' past history, et cetera. If diverse is getting clearly defined anywhere, or
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but maybe my look at it is really focusing in on what's going on in the general education classroom, the core curriculum, and determining what type of differentiation is going on already with those teachers is really the best angle at trying to help not having or handle the diversification that you have in kids going in and out of special ed or ELL or what have you. Really making sure that those teachers are armed with the tools necessary in the general education classroom to handle the diversification of the students there. I don't know if that's really...
I was in a general education classroom.
But,
yeah.
Yeah, but...
I'd like to add just a little context as well. So there's no doubt that the focus on math and ELA is being driven by that's what we have test scores on that we can actually use to start bringing some evidence to something like the Danielson framework.
Yeah.
Okay? So if we had more measures and better measures, we could use those. So that's a limitation, and I don't think you've said anything that many people would disagree with, all right? But I would also say that if we can't teach kids basic math and basic reading and writing, and we can't have teachers that can teach that we're at a non-starter for moving forward, and we shouldn't let the fact that we don't have good measures across other subjects and areas paralyze us about what we need to do with teacher evaluation, what we need to do with finding out who good teachers are, what characteristics they have. You know, I really want to caution us against sort of getting paralyzed because we can't measure across other subjects, et cetera. And for example, there's no evidence whatsoever that a good portfolio generates good student achievement. Now, we would all think that it would.
Yeah.
But,
I think
I hate to be a hard-nosed empiricist, but bring me some data and let's show that a good portfolio is actually good for promoting student achievement.
I think I encouraged data. I think I was more concerned about using the ELA and math test scores as the data.
Okay, we have several people who still want to ask some questions and not very much time.
Hello, I'm Brandon Weirs. I'm from the Winton Woods School District in Ohio. It's a suburb of Cincinnati, and I'm an observer only of the Cincinnati school system, not an educator or a person with students in that system. But I have noticed that the evaluation system that you described that produced the data that you did your research on is no longer going to be available. I've been told that they've discontinued the use of that evaluation system.
They actually haven't discontinued it, but they've certainly pared it back.
Yes, it's unfortunate that it's labor intensive. That was the take on it that I was provided. But then the second observation I have about that system is that they just this past year in Ohio's evaluation system went from continuous improvement to effective, and they did it not by increasing their AYP or other measures, but by, in fact, raising their value-added achievement. And you said at your opening remarks that they didn't use that. I was wondering if you'd clarify that.
They don't use it for any kind of teacher evaluation, or so they've got it. They may use it for for whole school or district measures, but they're not using it for any teacher evaluation.
Good morning, Keisha Copeland with Atlanta Public Schools. I just have a quick question. I remember you saying that your tenured teachers, you evaluate them once every 5 years. Could you expound a little bit on that, and if you have any strategies in place on measuring their effectiveness throughout the 5 years? Are there any strategies in place?
I'm only 50% with your question, exactly what you're asking. So you are right that in Cincinnati, under the old system, that's now actually being pared back, as this gentleman suggested, because of budgetary concerns. In their old system, as you coming in as a new hire, whether you had experience or had 0 years of experience, you went under a full evaluation. You went under another full evaluation 3 years later to move into what a career teacher status, which is getting tenure. Once you're a career teacher, you're evaluated. You have a full evaluation every 5 years. You get an annual evaluation every year, which is a principal walking through and evaluating you.
Okay.
And with that, we'll stop.